Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 368th episode of Constructed Criticism. I am your prompt host, Mason, joined by my timely co-host, Abe. Abe, how you doing?
I'm doing great.
Glad to hear that. That's awesome. Well, we're
It's
here.
rare
hmm
that someone refers to me as timely, though. Did you know that I have like a history of being really late to things?
I did not know that, but I didn't want to dagger you and call you like late or whatever, because sometimes like the co-host is the opposite. I thought that'd be rude, and then I'm sure you've cast a couple timely reinforcements in your day, so I was like,
That's true. That's true. I have.
yeah. Do
I
you
just don't
think
want everyone to get the sense that I'm someone I'm not.
No, that's fair. Yeah, you don't want people being like, "Well, I heard on the constructive criticism they're very timely, and they're 10 minutes late." They're like probably dead in a car accident or something. The only logical explanation, they're timely after all. So,
Nope, I just run late a lot. Just happens.
well, that's reasonable. Well, we won't be late on this week's episode. Last week our episode got lost to time, and truly a terrible one to mulligan. It was the mulliganing episode, and I think it was great. And we're gonna have to recover that topic here, probably post Forgotten Realms. But in case you didn't know, at the time you were listening to this recording, there's actually a new set dropping on Arena, which basically means it's out for the whole world. About a week from now, so on July 8th. So it's time for our new tradition of a wrap up episode and kind of a recap on the last standard set, where we kind of go over the Pick 2 set review. We talk about what we got right, what we got wrong, and the lessons we've learned from it as a way to improve and kind of contextualize the format. And this one's going to be a pretty interesting one. I think all things considered, the set was, not to bury the lead, a little lower power level, which we kind of expected going in and kind of proved to be true for the most part, minus a few outliers that I'm sure we're going to talk about later today. But first, David, we need to focus on our always improving always improving. I'm just gonna cut all this out. I got this. I got this. Calm, cool, collected. Our always improving portion of the podcast. It's really what we try to focus on. And Abe, what was your always improving moment this week?
Yeah, so my always improving moment this week is kind of just, I don't know, one of the more important things I think you can really do. And it was kind of inspired by listening to a lot of Table for Two podcast, where Alexander Hayne, on one of the episodes I was listening to, said something to the effect of like people's least favorite thing to do is think. And so if you're thinking, you're like, that's very valuable. When you're putting in the thinking, you're going to get to a lot better conclusions than people who really seek to avoid it in a lot of ways. And so I've really been thinking very actively and trying really hard to engage myself very actively in thinking about the problems that I face, either when I play games of Magic on Moto or Arena, or, when I am going out and playing disc golf, when I'm playing like a game of Valorant. I'm really trying to make sure that my brain is actively working through the problems in front of me, and I'm, thinking critically about uh, just about everything I'm facing to make sure I'm making the decision that I can, rationalize and stand behind the best, rather than just relying on a heuristic or kind of going with someone else's judgment all the time. Um, I don't know. I think it's really been paying off. I felt like, this weekend I played the Sunday Pauper Challenge with the Squirrel Storm deck, and that deck is, a little difficult. You gotta know what all your cards do and like how the math works out on not even just generating mana and stuff, but also a lot of times it helps to know. You have to have a feel for how likely it is that you can go off the next turn versus this turn, or what you're really aiming to do. And I think that I wouldn't have had as much success as I did if I wasn't doing this. I just think it's really helped me just be focused on improving in a more active way, and seeing dividends from like the things I do, rather than kind of saying, oh, it would be nice to like, oh, I should have done that better. Like, I know better. Well, it doesn't matter that I know or could have done better if I'm not putting myself to doing better. And so I've been really trying to put myself to do better.
I love to hear that. Well, you mentioned you did well in it. Did you go one to a personal best for you, or how did you do in the Popper Challenge?
Oh, I top aided
Oh,
at
nice.
5-1. I was like the 5 seed. I lost to QB Turtle, the unbeatable quarterback.
The goat.
Uh, yeah. He had a really, really good take on Blue Black Delver, where he was just starting to play miscalculations and spell pierces,
Hmm.
um, to kind of attack the fact that there's this storm deck running around. And Because usually the blue pauper decks kind of like focus more on counterspell and dispel, just like focused, lean, hard answers. But he was willing to play the flexibility to be able to answer, a deck that's as much of a problem as a storm deck is. And then I wound up losing in top eight to burn to some pretty unlucky galvanic relays for like 5 and 6 that needed to not hit either so many lands or hit any ritual that wasn't Seething Song, so that I could kill my burn opponent. But that's how it is when you play a deck like that. It's about the numbers, and I played to the best of my ability and mulligan to the best of my ability to be in a position to win. Where normally, if I cast a relay with a Chatterstorm in my hand for 5 or for 6, um, I'm pretty likely to win there. That's usually the winning state. I did everything I could, and then from there I had to play on and do my best to try to scrap it out after fizzling, but didn't come together.
Sure.
It was a great tournament. It's always good to play one where you top eight, but even better is to play one where you just feel good about how you play.
Nice. We'll love to hear it. That was also your bonus episode of Common Knowledge this week. Yeah, well, I love that, always improving, and spoilers. These were also our improving things from the last time. So we've been kind of working on these for like 2 weeks now. And so mine was the same it was last week, which y'all didn't unfortunately get to hear, which was I've had 2 little local like modern tournament things, or like just like cash window boxes basically. And my goal for both of them was just to go in there and play well, play attentively, and not mess up a bunch of stuff, and be basically focused and tuned in. And it's the thing that I think a lot of people thought about, or at least joked about, like, whoa, when quarantine's over, I'm gonna miss so many triggers. And I've had a couple of them now, and I've done pretty well at making sure not to do that sort of stuff and to be mindful and not miss. I think like I tried to cast a Bone Shard as an instant in like a pre-tournament match, and that's about the only thing I've done that was like really boneheaded. Which also, by the way, Bone Shard not being an instant is crazy to me. I have to discard a card. That's a lot. Anyways, yeah. But besides that, that's been kind of my goal, is to do that sort of thing, and it's kind of hand in hand with yours. And it's funny how those things kind of line up without us even talking about that at least last week. So
Yeah.
yeah. Yep, those are my.
Yeah, I think that's a great one too, is to like focus on just like your paper mechanics, especially after taking time off. So I'm glad that's been working out for you. Those local tournaments can go on.
I've been splitting the top 4. I've played a different deck every time. I played Prowess last week, and then the Asmiranda deck this week. I gotta say that Asmiranda deck is both impressive and unimpressive at the same time. There's a lot of things that like don't feel like they'd be really good, and they don't feel exactly really good, but they're good enough. I don't know. I don't think Urza Saga is getting banned anytime soon. I'll say that for the podcast, but I'm sure we'll get back to that in Modern someday.
That's a spicy one.
I'm not even sure if it's the best card in the set. I think it might be second best. So it's a crazy world we live in for sure. But that's gonna do it for this week's Always Improving segment. If you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/ccmtg. One of the perks that is getting to ask a question on the show. This week we're actually going to skip it because these review shows take a little bit longer than normal. But next time you can ask a question, get ready to go. We try to work them into the episode. And sometimes we even actually love the question so much they turn into a whole episode. So if you want to support the show, go to patreon.com/ccmtg. You can join the Discord, have a conversation. Show will always be free, but if you want to show that extra appreciation, that's great. And another way for you to support us is actually to help you get more Magic cards. You can go to oasisgames.com and order your Magic cards. You can pick up your Asmirandas, your Science Dracos, your Urza Sagas, your Dragon Rage Channeler, maybe the best card in the set. Who knows? Pick those cards up and many, many more. And use code WOULDTHATBEGOOD at checkout to get 15% off your first order. And use code CCMTG to get 4% back on every order. So you can pick up more stuff.
And if you're not someone who's so into the paper cards and you just love battling on your arena account, well, you had better get ready to hit the new set coming out in just about a week in style by going over to GreyVikingGames.com. They have all of the freshest cosmetics, promo packs, pre-release booster codes, all of the things that you could need for your account for dollars and not gems, for pimping out all those sweet, sweet digital cards on balling on a budget, as they say. And if you're really balling on a budget, you want to save 10% with code CCMTG at checkout. over to our friends at greyvikinggames.com. So,
100%, we'd love to have them. Time to go on to our review episode. So, like I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to spend this week talking about Strixhaven, kind of in its life so far, its time in the sun of Standard. And we're going to be talking about the old pick two cards we did, and if we were right, if we were wrong, and the things we learned from both situations. And, last time we did this was Abe's idea. Abe only got to grill me on my decisions and my choices because, unfortunately, Abe wasn't here at that point. But now I get to ask Abe these questions as well. It's so exciting. We get to look back on things. And so normally, in the Pick 2 set reviews, if you've been with us before, we have 5 categories and we talk about 2 cards each like we're going to do next week for Forgotten Realms. This week, though, we're only going to talk about 3 categories: hits, hopefuls, and sleepers. And that way we can kind of focus down on more things. And these cards are really the cards that we expect to see the most play a lot of the time, or end up seeing the most play, where we learn the most about. So that's why we like to focus in on those. And let's start off with sleepers. Abe, before we go any further, what were your 2 sleepers for the set? And I'll say mine as well.
so my 2 sleepers were Decisive Denial and Blade Historian.
Yep, mine were Baleful Mastery and Magma Opus. I think in the episode I specifically mentioned Magma Opus for Historic, but also having a chance to see play in Standard. And I kind of want to say the first thing I've really learned from these is that these cheating mana cards don't always push into the format like you would expect them to. Like Magma Opus has done a decent amount of play in Historic. We see it as a way to get payoff of Mystic Mastery and things like that. And its ability to ramp you a little bit matters. And Baleful Mastery being a cheap answer that, sometimes turns into a hard answer for 4 mana has been nice, but they haven't really broken into Standard in the way I kind of expected them to. And I thought there'd just be a lot more of that. And that's been pretty telling because I think normally one of the ways that, I don't know about you, when I look for cards, I look for cards that A, reward me from playing good games of Magic, and B, cheat the mana system. Those are kind of the 2 things I'm always looking at when it comes to cards. So how do you feel about that before we hop into some of your cards and some more general thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that those were like real misses at all. I think that it's really hard for a card right now to break into Standard, which is, I think, what something we're going to say over and over again is that, like, Eldraine sets the bar impossibly high on power level. Like, impossibly high on power level for so many of these cards to compete. And, I think that both Baleful Mastery and Magma Opus were, like really solid picks. Baleful Mastery certainly on rate with cards we've seen play in Standard previously, and a card that I think, maybe once we're out of Eldraine's Wild Ride, will be a card we'll see a lot more often in removals packages, and it's a card that's cropped up. I think it was in like some of the original Rogues lists when the set dropped in Historic, and maybe even some in Standard. And Magma Opus, of course, a big finisher in the like Torrential Gear Hulk decks, and like Jeskai control for a bit. So I don't want to call these misses at all. I think that your method of evaluating, saying they're cards that are good in a good old fashioned game of Magic that also have a bit of flexibility and can be a little more efficient than priced is a good way of evaluating it. It's definitely different than how I tend to evaluate things, but it certainly is a good one.
Well, I want to kind of talk about how do you normally evaluate stuff, and how does that play into your cards, etc. So what's different about that from you? Because for me, it feels like it's so hard always because context drives the card so much. Like there are a lot of cards that see play that you're like, that's all play. When someone comes back to Magic, and you're like, yeah, it was great in its format. Doesn't see play anywhere else. So and so for me, I look for like those 2 things because they're so ubiquitously good in Magic. Like things that just reward me for playing the game normally do really well, like Planeswalkers, and same for cheating mana. So what about it for you?
So I think that like it's important to be efficient, but that's only one way that cards end up being good, right? Like there are cards that like enable things to be broken on the mana system, and then it's like, you find a way to cheat around with it, right? Like Winota is a card that like kind of cheats on the system in mana, but also just like generating massive card advantage. My picks on this one were kind of more on the like efficiency or flexibility line. I think cards that are very flexible wind up being a lot better than cards that are very efficient and rigid.
Mm.
Like, there's only so many decks that want to play Lava Spike, but there's lots of decks that want to play Counterspell, for example. Like you can just
Or even
do a
lightning
lot.
bolt.
Right, yeah. I mean, um,
Mm.
but you'd think that maybe, or even like Negate, that like there's lots of decks and lots of different archetypes that want to play a card like Negate, partially because it's efficient, but also because it's extremely flexible in the things it answers, whether it be, you know, threats or, opposing disruption. Um, that's not something that like necessarily has to cheat on mana. And I think cheating on mana lately has been like one of the more busted things, and is always kind of just one of the most busted things. But
Yeah.
uh, it's not something I always feel like I have to look for because uh, I do think that a lot of the time it's about like efficiency doesn't have to be cheating on mana. It just has to be like an ability to disproportionately affect the game compared to what you're paying for it,
Mm.
or consistently affect the game in a positive way.
Sure.
Right?
Okay.
So like it doesn't have to be like Magma Opus being cast way ahead of schedule is disproportionately affecting the game at that stage of the game.
Yeah.
Magma Opus on 8 is also still kind of disproportionately affecting the game some of the time. I don't know
Mm.
if you've cast a Magma Opus in like Modern Cube, but you can pay 8 mana for that card and it's really good. Same with Baleful Master, you can pay 4 mana for that and it's worth it, but I don't know, when I think about like my sleepers looking at like Blade Historian and Decisive Denial, I think that's like almost a perfect example of the kind of cards that I'm kind of drawn to when I think of, the innocuous cards in sets, which is that like, Decisive Denial is two like acceptable rate effects in like being the mana leak or the fight spell. But the fact it is both is what made it really special to me and why I thought it was why it had a lot of potential. And Blade Historian has the potential to double the power of all of your creatures effectively with double strike or make them, impossible to block
Mm.
because people can't be blocking them double strike creatures and keeping their creatures sometimes. You know what I'm saying?
No, that's true.
So it's a little more than just cheating on like the mana you spend to cast it. I guess is like kind of my point. I try to look at the impact a card can have on the game. Like I try to look at usually a card's floor is where I start, and then the ceiling is like if it's super high and the floor is high, then obviously that card's really good. But being very flexible raises a card's floor in the average case for when someone plays it. So uh, I tend to try to look a lot at the floor and then compare it to like the other cards that it could be like. So
Sure, that's fair. And for what's worth, Decisive Denial has, I don't know if you've noticed, but in the blue green historic decks, it's become a 3 or 4 of in all of those, along with cards like Negate out of the sideboard to be like a more flexible, stompy deck. So,
yeah,
it has seen play, and
it
all
was
the
also in
way.
the Team or Luca decks for like a long time. I'd always play when I was playing the SCGs before the SCG Tour Online stopped. Like I would constantly have to be playing around one or two copies out of the Team or Luca deck. I played against some variants of green blue stompy decks that were kind of dubious, but you know, backed up by the card and it looked very good there. So I feel like that was kind of a hit and or at least a good call on what a sleeper was. And Blade Historian also did see play in a lot of Winota decks, although those didn't really hang on for the length of the format.
Yeah, I'm curious if those will come back. With we're getting our last set. Like we're gonna talk about this a bunch next week, but Forgotten Realms is essentially the core set this time. We don't quite know if the power level is supposed to be equal to a core set or more equal to like a base set as you would. So it's a little confusing as to how strong Sand's actually going to be. But this is normally that time where they're like, hey, we know cards are rotating. Here's something that's a little more oomph. I think of like Sorin, Lord of Innistrad is like a good example of that, where it's like there's a little bit of time where we had that and Champion Dusk in the same standard format, and that was busted, and they knew it was busted, and it's a powerful thing to do in historic still. So yeah, I'm curious to see how that stuff plays out. And I think one of the things that I really like about both our picks is that they're reasonable, but they still have the chance to be completely unreasonable cards. If that makes sense, like when they actually play out. And I think that's something really good for to look at, because one thing that I don't know how much you get this, Abe, and we probably got a lot more back at Star City, but sometimes we get comments like, oh, is this really something I should be looking at, or is like this actually good enough for a game of Magic? And I think we did a good job of not, you know, being too scared of it and identifying cards that really do have big impact when they see play. Like a fight spell and a counter spell split card makes play a lot harder and a lot, makes it a lot more difficult and tricky. Same with like the double striker out of the Winota decks there with Blade Historian.
Yeah.
And there was a chance that card even maybe saw play in the mono white decks. That was talked about for the first couple of days. So I think that sort of thing is really big and really helpful to look at, and is hopefully good for players who I think sometimes one thing that's like when you first start playing, right, Abe, is that people tell you to think about the worst case possible first. Because what happens is new players tell you like, so I got 16 zombies and I cast my spell and my spell says with all the zombies, and like they're like, okay, but like what if you have like a zombie or two? And so I think they they overcorrect, right? And then it becomes dies the Doomblade guy, and they're like, oh, it dies to everything. And so it's good to course correct a little bit there. I'm glad that we were able to kind of highlight that there. I will say if I could go back, the one thing I would maybe put over Baleful Mastery or change, and it's probably funny because it probably should be in the hit as well as Expressive Iteration. I think that card is kind of the one that was a little...
For me,
oof.
I think Expressive Iteration was kind of talked about enough for me to say it was a hit. Like at the time, I remember like I think Jerry wrote about it. Probably Todd wrote a thing about it or wanted to. I imagine it's like kind of a card I think he would like.
After it came out, but maybe it wasn't.
I think it was like all leading right up to it. It's with the previous seasons the way they are, it just is all such a blur. But a card that I think got absolutely like, I don't know, just totally flew under the radar, but then immediately was like a role player improving one of the best decks was Quandrix Cultivator. That card, like, it made it so that Sultai didn't have to play like Essica's Chariot anymore, and like could always have like it just had more mana sources and was able to like stay the ground a lot more. It made the mono red matchup very different for that card to be around, and like I think Quandrix Cultivator is probably the biggest sleeper there was. If you're gonna say that like if we're gonna say that Expressive Iteration's off the table, I think Cultivator just like I don't know, it just really outperformed I think everyone's expectations of it. It was just another good gold, draft card. It was going to be a good rate that gets you a land, like whoop-de-doo, but the fact that it was a play you can make on 4 and leave up Mystical Dispute really mattered in the mirror matches and mattered against Teamer. The fact it was a body that you could commit that early really mattered, especially against decks like Rogues, where sometimes you needed to like put a little pressure on them if they were going to play a more controlling game against you as Sultai. Card was just really good.
Yeah, that's true. That's a great call, actually. The Cultivator was a really big one. And I'm sure when we kind of talk about the standard format near the end, it will come up again. Let's talk about our hopefuls. Mine were Velmachus Lorehold, which I believe at the time was specifically for historic, and Marinda, the student advocate, which was also historic, but with a potential for standard. What were your two hopefuls before we go into it?
My two hopefuls were Daemogoth Titan and Quandrix Command.
I forgot about the Titan making the list.
The Thicky Titan. It's so big.
Well, do you want to do? We should maybe we talk about the Titan. It needs to get some time in the sun.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing, and I'm in defense of Daemogoth Titan, right? I really was hopeful that a card like this could be like possibly good. It is just big, and like that's kind of why I'm hopeful for it. This is a section where I get to pick cards that I just think like, if these get to see play and these are cards people are excited about and play with, that's awesome, and I love that. Daemogoth Titan is peak that to me because we could have had Jund Fury. It could have been on the table. It could have been a thing. Who knows? Like a little double its power flick Cosmos Fury you for 22 upstairs. It was all possible. It just didn't happen. And, it's tough out there with Brazen Borrower floating around to pay 4 mana for an 11/10 that has a huge drawback to be involved in combat and does nothing else. But...
And then you have to also play it.
But... it was sweet. And, the kind of thing that is a little exciting. I think Quandrix Command is a card I had a little more hope for, that like when we came to this episode, it would have, seen play in a copy or two. But again, it's kind of gameplay that's really smothered by the way that this format is, like people aren't really casting too many artifact enchantment spells that you can interact with or want to interact with. bouncing creatures and planeswalkers. Like generating tempo like that is not really a thing that most of the blue-green decks want to do because they're kind of mid-rangey. Or if you're generating tempo, it's much, much better to do it with Goldspan Dragon and with cards that protect Goldspan Dragon. Um, and like the combat trick mode also wasn't that great. So, I was hopeful. I think they still have a chance. I think maybe less so Damio Titan. That really was just kind of a pet thing. But who knows? It is still big and will always be big. 21 points of power and toughness distributed across a card for 4 mana is a lot. But I do think Quandrix Command has a good chance after rotation to show up, and maybe it's once it's explored, it's not really in the play patterns of the format, but it could be. And I think it's a card that if a card like that is good, which is what I said during the episode, if a card like that is good, I'm happy about it, and I like those kinds of games. So
Yeah, I think Quandrix Command has like a real shot to come up, and it's the sort of thing that looks for certain play patterns to be the thing and to support certain play patterns that aren't always the easiest, right? And I think the Eldraine cards definitely don't help with those play patterns. And we know once those things leave and we have a smaller standard format, I think both these cards have a much bigger chance to shine. I think Dagomoth Titan strikes me as a card that in a 5-set standard has a much more realistic, like,
yeah,
hey, like things aren't as strong, and I'm an 11-10. You know, like
I'm still big.
yeah, exactly. So I think there's like a real chance for something like that to actually kind of break through, and it definitely it's interesting because that's a card that I think a lot of people were pretty low on, but some people did have real hopes that Dagomoth Titan would be like an actual player just because of how large it actually is. And being that large, as the kids would say, is powerful in certain environments. So that's something that I definitely keep my eyes on.
Yeah.
Looking,
So
mhm.
so what about yours?
Yeah. So probably should start with Velomachus. That card got Time Warp banned. I mean, I
That
don't.
it did.
Yeah, the Time Warp Velomachus deck just kind of overtook Historic and overtook. I guess it was a League weekend or maybe it was a Pro Tour. It's also confusing since the end of organized play and the way it's been. So it's unclear to me actually what killed it when it came to like that weekend. But the data kind of showed it was too good. And Velomachus plus Time Warp wasn't like I put on my my science hat and figured it out. It was kind of there. If you looked at all the cards in the set, Brian Gottlieb was talking about it a bunch. And none of us really had it in the previous season, but I think Zachary Keeney came out with the Indomitable Creativity build as like the first person. I think it actually got leaked. He was testing it for like a split weekend or something, and that deck was very, very strong. I actually didn't play with it very much, but it was a really powerful deck, and Velomachus continues to be a really powerful card. And I think my big thing I said about Velomachus in that episode was it's probably the best reanimator thing you can do in Historic. And cheating into play with Indomitable Creativity, that's the same thing in my head. And I think that's still true. And I think this card is going to be a card that we will see be a thorn in people's sides anytime it is really prominent in play. It is just very good at what it does.
Yeah, it's extremely powerful. It's kind of like, I don't know, an even more busted like Ojtai, where like I get it in play, I'm attacking with it, I'm drawing a card, but in this case I'm getting it in play, it's attacking you this turn. And because it's in a form of like Teferi, you probably can't interact with it. And it's going to cast the spell, so I'm going to get my mana's worth out of it immediately, and it fits in with some of the best stuff. And I don't know. I think that like the fact that it also existed with Time Warp and Mizzix Mastery, and this polymorph effect and Indomitable Creativity, and Brainstorm
And looting.
and looting. Which, by the way, the four cards I just named there are four Mystical Archive choices, all of which I think have performed phenomenally,
Yeah.
as one might expect.
Who knew that
Me being
Brainstorm
the only one
were
to
going to
pick.
be good?
Yeah, I mean, I picked the only one to get banned, so I think that
So far.
maybe I was a little more on. Yeah, we'll see how long the rest of them last.
Yeah.
But yeah, like that card, once the shell was there to get it into play, consistently and quickly, it was off to the races. I do wonder, is that what you wanted? Did you want it to really be that good, or did you want it to be kind of like a cool like tier 2 thing? Were you like happy that it was something that was really broken and really like powerful once it was happening? Or was it something where you were like kind of, like, is that like, is that really the kind of gameplay that we wanted?
Yeah, that this is kind of the hard part of these cards. So this gives me a great moment to soapbox, Abe. So thank you. So some people argue that we shouldn't print cards like Velomachus that do these sort of things because they have two modes most of the time, right? They have what happened with Velomachus and Time Warp, which is dominate the format, are not fun, and blah 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 blah. And the other mode is we never talk about Velomachus, and I come on this podcast and I say, well, hopefully in the next set, But like that is kind of it. But I think there's a middle ground that isn't really appreciated and explored, and that's kind of like the figuring out the Velomachus stuff. And a lot of people don't unfortunately partake with that because that's like it really appeals to a certain type of player. And for all the Velmachuses there's 20 that fail. And the ones that fail, people actually have a lot of fun with, I think, trying to figure out, and they win their couple games, and ultimately they decide not to play it, or they accept the bad win rate and they do play it. And I think that stuff's really good. So I like cards like Velomachus, and I actually don't mind them hitting as hard as this one did. I think specifically because Velomachus wasn't designed with Time Warp in mind, nor should it be. We've actually seen that start to see play in Modern a little bit. I believe Zan top 8 a challenge with a Velomachus Time Warp deck. So it's like basically the historic deck in Modern. But, that sort of thing I think is fine. And I'm okay with them hitting because you can always just get rid of it if it's too oppressive. But I think the real problem with these kind of cards is that they're fun in small doses. But when they're the thing to do, I don't love that because... Not because I don't like playing against it, because it's whatever. I'll try and figure out how to beat it or I'll play it myself. But for a lot of people, I know that's really frustrating when they log on to Arena and their experience for like an hour and a half is playing against 3 Velomachus decks in a row. Because if you play against the Velomachus decks 1 in 100 games, you're like, oh, that was really cool. And I saw this happen with a lot of streamers. They played against the Velomachus deck the first time, and they were like, whoa, that's really cool. What a cool deck. And then 3 weeks later, they're like, I hate my life, ban it. It's like, well, once it's 1 in 100 games you're not playing against Velomachus, your tune really changes. And I think that's true for a lot of things, I just think that things that combo out and like don't let you take turns invoke a pretty strong response. So, yeah. I don't know. I guess my answer is yes, but I kind of know for other people, selfishly yes, altruistically no. But
yeah, I think that like to me it kind of seemed like part of it was a historic bearing too much weight in Magic, kind of, right? Like, people can't play paper Magic, they can't play all of the formats that we've been offered for years and years prior. Historic is really carrying the weight of not being standard, and standard's in the predictably kind of mediocre place it can get to when it's extremely explored and there's cards that are just much better than the other cards. And then it just hit this breaking point. Well, one of the only 2 pro formats there is historic, and we found one broken deck, so yeah, everyone's gonna play it, and it's gonna be the best thing. But I do think that like I think a lot about Omnath and how Omnath was like so egregious because out of the box, all you had to do was play other landfall cards with it and some cultivates, and the card was already amazingly broken. It was just like so insane. And I think that, the fact that it took so long and for people to explore, this bulk mythic otherwise from Aether Revolt or Kaladesh Remastered, if you only play Arena, that like does the thing of polymorphing, and it played enough ways to like make these treasures that it could do it consistently, or Dwarven Mind to like make a 1/1. The fact that it took that much time and then there was this payoff of it being really good was kind of exciting, and I think that that's like, I agree with you, a success as a game piece like that when you're looking for a combo-y kind of I forget which archetype it is, but just a card that really excites the right kind of player. And I think that there's probably a lot of people who had a lot of fun playing the deck, and then probably by the time it was banned, they'd gotten all their jollies from it. So
yeah,
I'm also kind of pro things like that being allowed to happen, and it's I think it's not usually so bad if it's not half of the Magic people play.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think the thing that the last 3 or 4 years has really shown us in Magic is that if it's the same thing all the time, people don't really like it.
Yeah.
They like a good balance. Even if the balance is like 3 things instead of 2 things or 1 thing, the more they can get and sell that semblance of control that they really like. And they actually don't like too many choices because then they feel like they have no control. So it's a very, very hard job our friends at WotC have. But yeah, and that's kind of my thoughts on Velomachus. And then from Ravina, the owl teacher, um, you know, I love the feather decks. I love that kind of archetype. I love like the pump spell decks and standard and things like that, and those try to like get you dead decks. I really thought that having an ability to get a free spell on both turns with things like Defiant Strike being in the format might have pushed this over the top, but it still just has not enough pieces that are strong enough on their own, I think, and too many inherent flaws. Of like you need the pieces and you need to have already cast the pieces, and this thing needs to be protected, which means do you want to cast your spell? Because if you cast your spell, now you don't have that God's Willing in your graveyard. And I've played a good bit of this card, and when it felt to me, and the thing I underappreciated, and I'll try to think about more with these cards going forward, is I underappreciated how good it is at keeping itself alive, and then how that play pattern would make me play in the game. And what actually happened is it became Mavinda became target kill spell gets fizzled. If your opponent casts another one this turn, I die. Because I would just have a God's Willing in my graveyard, so my opponents have to be like Heartless Act. And I'd be like, aha, and they'd be like, all right, but I had another one. And I'd be like, well, good beats, I put my card in the graveyard.
Yeah.
And so I think while that card, it kind of like Velomachus, kind of like gets your eyes glowing and like, oh, you can really do some stuff. You can like Defiant Strike a bunch and get a lot more. I could play Giant Growth. And I think decks that try to incentivize you to Giant Growth or Giant Growth adjacent cards are awesome, and we should try to push for those decks more. Are good for Magic and good for Standard and even Historic, but it turns out the best thing to do with that kind of card is actually to play Protect the Queen with it, and then to never really use its ability until like your opponent puts the shields down, developing something, and then it becomes like, aha, Defiant Strike twice. So yeah, I think thinking about more how the cards are going to play out in the moment and what they will reward is something I should think about more. Because I think I realized that like, oh wow, my card's really good, and I think I even mentioned how having God's Willing and Snakeskin Veil will be good with this card, and maybe that's going to be the trick, is like a white-green build of it. And I failed to realize like, okay, if I can make my creatures never die, will I ever use the other modes of this card? And the answer is no. If all my creatures are indestructible or take 2 kill spells, I'd rather do that mode. So that's kind of the lesson I learned from this, and my thoughts on that card as well.
Yeah, I also think that there's something to be said for the fact that a card like that plays so much higher on the curve than it seems like it would, because it's a card that you can't cast, and like it goes, you want to build a deck that around having all of these effects, but it's not a card you want to cast unless you already ideally have a Snakeskin Veil or God's Willing in the graveyard so it can protect itself, or you have one in hand and like can use your Defiant Strikes freely and then use these cards from hand to protect it, and then it's set up. It's kind of like Kira Great Glass Spinner, which is like just counters the first thing that targets a creature you control every turn. And in that, just you have to force through the shields it has on it. But your deck has to kind of be proactive enough and then also have that. And there's only so much room for a card like this to fit into the rest of that going on. And I think we kind of saw with the Feather decks too, where like Feather in Standard was kind of backing up like Dreadhorde Arcanist being powerful and like Reckless Rage being powerful with it, and controlling the board in that way, but without having so many things to develop that you can also like use. I think Dreadhorde Arcanist is probably one of the better ones, but it's hard to make a card like that work, and also the card isn't just a 3-mana 2/3 flyer that then starts generating a bunch of card advantage. It's actually kind of like a 5 or 6 mana card because of all the other things you have to do to get it in play in the position you want it to be for it to be at its best.
Yeah, 100%. Let's move on to our hits. My hits were Leonin Lightscribe and Mika Crafty Companion. Abe, what were your hits?
My hits were Silver Quill Silencer and Vanishing Verse. And I was actually really surprised that neither of these caught on. But also at the same time, I guess like there's not many decks playing black and white at the same time. So at least not in Standard. So maybe I shouldn't have been so surprised, but it seemed like the core was all there and that Vanishing Verse was like a pretty solid answer. But
yeah, Vanishing Verse, it has seen some play in Modern and Pioneer and Historic. But yeah, when it comes to Standard, It has been kind of gone, and it's like you said. There's just not much incentive to be black and white. Turns out all the good adventure creatures are in Teamer.
Whoa!
No,
Crazy!
no, but jokes aside, like there just hasn't been that oomph to be that sort of deck. There's not a real payoff. There's not really enough in the metagame that rewards you. And I want to get into that talking here in just a little bit once we're done for talking about these cards. But yeah, I am surprised Vanishing Verse has not seen play. Silver Quill Silencer, it's a really cool card. I think it's really awesome, but I'm not super surprised about that one, to be honest. I don't know. How do you feel about that statement?
I I still think that's a card that you're underestimating. I think it's really held down by Bone Crusher Giant because uh it's a 3/2 for 2, and the fact that you can mix Bone Crusher Giant with the other removal and they still have such a density. The deck that would be good in at Naming Stomp doesn't exist, but I think that card is still very powerful. Anytime you get a card off of it or it makes your opponent play awkwardly and your deck is aggressive, um, it feels like that's a good card. I'm still hopeful that this card makes waves. I think it's still got a long, long journey ahead of it where it will show up somewhere. I think that you're like
I agree
I
with
think
your
that you're
long
kind
statement.
of I think you're really underselling cards like this. But maybe I'm overselling them. Like I do like I really like Meddling Mage, but Meddling Mage like literally bricks a card, whereas this card gives your opponent a bad choice, but uh like 3 life and a card is a lot. Like a lot. And when there's like 1 or 2 cards that are really only worth naming, like if we get to a point where there's a format where people are playing sweepers again, this is instantly a card that you're gonna want to have in your white black aggressive deck and just name the sweeper, because then they're going to have to find a removal spell for this and then their sweeper, which already makes it worse for them because ideally they'd want to cast their sweeper and then cast their removal spell on the next thing. Or they're just going to cast the sweeper. You're going to get an additional hit out of this card and draw a card. So then it's like you're going +1 and an attack as if they just had the removal spell later anyway. So I think it's got time. I'd like to see after rotation. I could be eating my words on this one in 6 months, but
I
I
want to
would
see this one in
be
a year.
very surprised. I would be very surprised if this card never is a card that I mess around with and put in a deck, or is a card that I even register for an event. So
You would be surprised. So you're telling me if with Innistrad dropping, SCGs and GPs have come back, which of course they're not, but whatever, we're gonna pretend they are. That you believe that over the time from now to the next rotation, when these cards leave, that you would be shook if you did not at least think about registering that card.
this one's for the YouTube people. All right, I got my 4 binder right here.
There's four
Check it.
Silver Quill
I've
Silencers.
got 4 Silver Quill Silencers right here, ordered from our friends at Oasis Games. They hooked it up. One of them's even the full art,
That's true.
the like extended border. And look, I got these Skyclave operations. This is already the start of a good deck.
I was gonna say this is like the classic, the guy she tells you not to worry about, because above the card is 4 Apparition and below is 4 Skyclave Scourges, which are like multiple format powerhouses.
Yeah, but Silver Quill Silencer, I think, has that kind of potential. It just needs time.
It needs
Okay,
Every king needs a
that's
strong
all
queen.
I'm saying is that it needs a little time and needs things to be right for it. And Vanishing Verse, also an amazing card on raid at answering things. And I especially thought it would be better in Modern, but Heliod kind of also dwindled at the same time, and Vanishing Verse fell off because exiling Heliod was not as important anymore. But these cards are both just kind of not allowed in Standard, because if you're going to be playing a deck that is not playing the adventure cards and not playing Edgewelling Keeper, like what are you doing? You have to be playing a monocolored snow-based aggressive deck or a 2-color snow-based deck with like Goldspan Dragon. That's like really all we're seeing out of the format. And so, give it some time. Give it time for format to not be just about the things it's about right now. And maybe Silver Quill Silencer naming Goldspan Dragon will be Chef's Kiss.
Maybe it will. Maybe
Come
it will.
on, Mason. Give me a little bit. Don't tell me
I
that
got
you can't understand.
I got you on Vanishing Verse easily. So the thing is for me is when I hear you talk about the card, is it feels to me like a lot of the times you're talking about curve out situations, but the punish is much stronger in those curve out situations. But that's not normally how it kind of plays out with the black white aggressive decks a lot of the time. Like they're normally a little bit more resilient and durable. So like their strength is things like that, right? Where like the board wipe doesn't hurt them as much, or the stomp doesn't hurt them as much. But they don't push the damage like an Embercleave deck does. Where like an Embercleave deck would love to have Silver Quill Silencer because it's like, okay, I actually hit you for enough that 3 damage on turn 4 is a real cost for you, where I'm going to turn into a real cost. You just don't know that yet, like with a Phoenix from Ash, right? And so I kind of have a little problem there where you seem to be speaking of it, thinking of it like a Meddling Mage more, where it's like, this card's basically Meddling Mage because I put them at 3 when it happens. But I think you're going to put them to like 9, which is still good. I'm not saying the card's terrible, but I'm a little more suspect of it. Giving it the hit title is big. Don't worry, I got 2 bad cards. You get to get me in a second.
I just think, and this is the last thing I want to say about it because we already think I've spent way more time on it than either of us would have wanted. But I think that the fact that it's like those scenarios I'm thinking of are the obvious ones. But I think the fact that when you name a mid-range deck's ideal turn 3 or 4 play, or you name like the opposing aggressive deck's curve out top end card, it does change those situations so much. Like if I was able to play a deck that I'm like named Torbran, then suddenly like racing you is kind of more on the table. Maybe not Torbran exactly, but if I name Embercleave, then suddenly you're at 17, right? Because you're going to need that card to kill me. Or if I name, my opposing Blade Historian, right? If there's a card that your deck operates on, it suddenly makes it so that card is much worse when I draw this card, and the card is good on rate. So I think that it's...
I think that's not true, though, when you're saying that. I think it's actually the opposite of what you said is true. So I think like in a deck like Winota, because my deck functions, I must play my card, and I'm rewarded a lot for playing my card, right? So like if I slam Winota, I'm paid off big. But if you like have a deck full of medium cards, then naming your card has more impact because its impact isn't as strong. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I don't know. There's got to be a way to get information on their hand. There's going to be ways.
No,
it's going to happen.
I agree.
We're going to be tired of winning, Mason. Us here at Silverquill, we're going to win until we're tired of winning.
I'm just saying that I think that your statement is true the more equal in power level your cards are. But the more drastically powerful your cards are, if they have life to spare, I think the worse that card gets.
Yeah.
Because like,
it's not going to be as good as Meddling Mage against Winota, which is kind of like a combo aggro deck for sure. But I think that if I named Lovestruck Beast against some of these decks, like that's kind of big that they either have to take 3 to cast a Lovestruck Beast and then risk me having an answer to it, like Skyclave Apparition.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just don't agree with
it, right? Like
the Torbran. Winota.
I mean, I
just wanted to...
Yeah, well, those cards are just kind of egregious on their own, right? Those cards are just kind of some of the more powerful top-end cards we've seen, but...
I agree, that's why Meddling Mage is so good. It stops it.
Well, yeah, because when cards are too good, Meddling Mage can answer it. But this card isn't... It's not the Meddling Mage for unfair things. It's the Meddling Mage for fair things. It, like, rewards you for pegging their hand and getting it right.
Yeah.
Anyway, Mason,
Silverquill Silencer rewards you for having curving out.
Tell me about them.
Yeah, Silverquill Silencer really says, hey, draw your best hand. If you do, I really lose. You're watching it all. Ava's just hit his head on the desk. All right, my cards are just complete all-stars. I don't know why we're not talking about them sooner. We have Leonin Light Scribe and Mika the Crafty Companion. I'll start with the Light Scribe because I think it plays into the bird owl lady that we talked about a second ago. And I really thought that sort of thing would be strong. Like there's like a good chance for it too. Like having a Magecraft aggressive deck. And Dragon Scale Elite, I think, is a card that I forgot to mention in the show, but I thought was good. It's the 2-drop that has Magecraft +1/+1 counters, and you can like spend 5 or 6 to double its counters. And I think that card's really strong. I think both these cards are really strong. They're just not, they haven't done their thing yet. And I think they're kind of in the same vein as Silverquill Silencer, where there's a chance that they're going to see play and be big parts of a format. I wouldn't be surprised if those homies hold hands together. But I think it's a little harder for them to make that bust through into the format. And I just think Leonin Light Scribe requires a little bit too much, and the payoff's a little too hard to really get going for Leonin Light Scribe. And I think I actually gave Clover Illuminancer an honorary mention at that time. That card is another big miss for what it's worth. That card has not done anything in any format. It is Turns out we
Yeah,
don't need the
it's a
12th
dud.
one drop in prowess if it's another color. We'll just get Dragon Rage Channeler 6 months later and be cool with it. So, or Ragavan, whatever. Who cares? Whichever one you want. But, I think that sort of thing, specifically for Standard, maybe has a chance. And we saw the green-white adventure decks do really well before. And I remember thinking that was going to be the trick, was you have creatures and spells. They're on the same cards. It's going to push you over the top. But it just did not play out like that. I doubt it will for the remainder of the adventure time. But yeah, I think it was just a little too much going on all at once, and the payoff is too little for all that's going on as well, barring an actual kill. So I think that's kind of part of the big miss on Leon. Do you want to talk about Leon and Lightscrab before I switch over? I know I kind of went on your Silver Quill Silencer, so I know.
Um, no, I just think that like if there's a lesson that I think I would try to give to you about cards like Leon Lightscribe
Mika.
and the other card that gets counters.
Oh, the the
Um,
the the scale lady. I forgot their name.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
but like I think that, and I don't think you're the only person who does this that I know, and I might even be wrong for being so down on cards like this, but I think cards that just really require you to have significant investment to enable them, like I think we're not in the age of like Curry and Dryad being a good card anymore. You know what I'm saying? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's so much weaker than it was because it's so much harder to have good cheap spells. They've kind of like really reined in how many of those they print. We get like Opt every now and again, and it's like pretty solid. And we always get Shock, but like they're privy to how good it is to be able to pay one man and cast a spell. Like Crash Through is like one of the better cantrips you ever get for red, or cheap spells you get for red. And I just think it's like hard to fit all of the things together. And so I was really kind of down on Magecraft because of that. I think that like it's never going to be a thing you're enabling efficiently, unless they were really to support it, which didn't look like they were going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so while cards like this tend to look really good and the upside looks really strong, like, you know, I think you pointed out that like it was good with the adventure creatures because when you cast the spell, half of it you'd trigger it, so your deck is kind of already meshed and has like a good number of creatures and spells. So it was going to be playing on game plan when you cast Heart's Desire, you'd be able to get a trigger and pump your whole team. But I'm just a little more wary of cards that require significant investment, either in like deck building or just for it to get to the point where it's like an actively good card,
Mm-hmm.
like ahead of rate. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think also Mika was like a solid choice
But by the way, it's
because
Mila. I knew I was saying something wrong the whole time. I wrote it wrong in the show notes before. I might even say it wrong during the set review, but it's Mila. I'm
it was
looking at the.
Mila.
It's
Okay,
Mila
yeah.
and
So
Luca. Yeah.
Mila, I think fell prey to the fact that I don't know, like I didn't even think I saw anyone play one in mono white, but it just seemed like it's kind of fighting for the 3 slot, which is really competitive in the aggressive decks anyway. And also, there's like no one's really defending planeswalkers right now in standard, and no one's like really pointing many removal spells at things because, especially in white, where white has Alseid and Selfless Savior, so it's kind of like your bases are already covered there. You drawing the card when it's targeted isn't that good, and Boros decks just never came together that way. But I think they're both solid picks. Both were like cards with good upsides and reasonable floors. Light Scribe not as much, but a much higher ceiling. When it's really good, you have a bunch of Clarion Spirit tokens and you cast a spell or two and then attack it. It probably is, the hammer you need it to be.
Yep.
But I don't know, just maybe I'm a little too cynical when it comes to cards that require significant investment because I've played on the side of undoing investment too often, where like Dice to Doomblade is kind of a valid criticism if you jump through a bunch of hoops to make something strong.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's Dice to Doomblade is kind of why, and like gets unsummoned. It's kind of why you don't see people just jamming random auras into their decks all the time anymore. That's not a thing that just happens.
Yeah.
It's the danger of it, and so
100%.
you know,
Yep. Yeah, and I would say the last one, the Mila that you mentioned, is there was maybe some thought that Scald decks could work with the new Snarl. and the snarls have just not really panned out. We were a little hesitant happening. We thought the red white one was the one with the most chance because their mana suck the most, but it just didn't really happen. Speaking of which, let's kind of talk about the big metagame at large real quick here for Strixhaven Standard, because I think the thing from my perspective that happened is when we went into it, we were kind of like, sheesh, what's going to happen? Like, are these decks just going to get a little upgraded? Are we going to play in the same decks? I think that's mostly true, but I feel like the format was underexplored a little bit. I think that narrative kind of got perpetuated, bore out a little bit in results. We did see the Prismari treasure deck pop up a little bit with Goldspan Dragon and Galazeth and stuff during some of the Pro Tours and whatnot, and it did really well, all things considered. But besides that, there were not a whole lot of new decks that really stood the test of the format over the course of all of it. And I think that while I think the Hive Mind's really good at figuring stuff out, I think we maybe rested on our laurels a little too much, and there wasn't enough incentive to play this standard format. And I think it feels to me like there was stuff there that was still going on that was still strong. And I feel this way specifically because I wrote an article for Card Kingdom, which you can check out each and every week at cardkingdom.com. And I talked about 3 decks that were underrated for standard. And it's funny because in my like blasted everywhere tweet, I put like my Prismari deck has the drip, and I built a Galazeth deck that was very, very similar to the one that we see now in standard. I was like 5 or 6 cards off. I had a very similar build. And my other decks in that article, I felt were not as strong as the Galazeth deck, but I felt like there was some real potential there. I think we maybe didn't quite fully explore this format, but also, sometimes it's hard to, and things like Historic really had people's attention. Then Modern Horizons came out, and so in that last little bit where sometimes you see some crazy deck pop up in the last month of standard, there was no real incentive, and there was just a lot of incentives to do other things. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on this standard format. I think it was fairly fun the amount I played of it, but I won't lie, I've got sub 100 games of the standard format, which is not a thing that's happened to me in a very long time.
Yeah, I think gosh, what was it? But I think the flow of the format was a little different from that. We did see like Jeskai Mutate actually did crop up, and that was kind of
Oh
like
yeah.
a finished job of refining all of what had been done by like the deck previous.
Mm-hmm.
Like all of that time passed, and the people who were really working on it refined this deck. Some people played it at the was it a Mythic Championship, a Pro Tour, a set championship. At
Set
the set
championship.
championship,
Mm-hmm.
uh, for the set as well as the Dragons deck. But I think that the only cards that made a really big splash to me were Elite Spellbinder out of the Naya Clarion deck, with like Rip Apart in the sideboard. I thought those were like pretty big additions because it handled the Henge problem that deck had, as well as kind of the need for playing a good amount of removal. You like could condense that into one slot, which was really good. And we saw iteration really show just how good it is. And so, like as the format went on, we went from people playing Sultai with new cards and playing Rogues to play around Sultai and playing Mono Red to play on Rogues. And I had that teamer list with like comas that some people ended up copying for like an SCG or two, which was but for a while it was just assumed that like teamer was probably the best deck, Teamer Adventures, um, to line up well against everything. But as the people played more games and as the power of like Goldspan Dragon's play pattern played out and expressive iteration backed it up, being a really good cheap card advantage, and card selection. Like we're kind of at this place now where the format the format's fine. I played the standard challenge immediately after the Pauper challenge yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
and all of my games were good. I didn't play a single game where I was unhappy. I thought the mirror matches I played a blue-red Dragons list that Kane Reinhardt sent me, where he kind of like took the lists that were out there and made a list that he liked. And so, like my matches were all interesting and good. Like uh, you kind of had to know what mattered in the matchups and figure out like which battles you were fighting. Were you leaving up counter magic? Were you casting your dragons for me? Or like, there was clearly decks that were preying on that play pattern. I lost to mono white, which seemed absolutely prepared for the blue red deck because all of the protection creatures plus plus Luminarch Aspirant and Giant Killer and Faceless Haven, just all of it together really really punishes everything going on in the blue red deck. And yeah, like I think the format was good. It was just that there was not a lot of powerful things that shifted the balance, outside of things that maybe tightened up the old decks that were not good enough. Like Expressive Iteration and like Spellbinder, kind of giving those decks just enough boost to compete even more. Um, and then seeing what decks were popular and how the matches were playing out and trying to fight on that on those axes and whatever. And as much as I think I don't usually play that many matches of standard unless there's tournaments. Um, and when I do, I do play a good bit. I think I maybe did my dailies with mono red and mono white a couple times on Magic Arena, and I played the one standard challenge, and I watched a good amount of the format, and I kept up with it beyond the SCGs I played in the very beginning of the format, but just not a lot happened, and I think the lack of tournaments that are really high profile. There were like some insight events that people followed, and the metagame did develop, and there was the set championships, but just not a lot happened. I think that that's better than everything changing all the time because, like I said, it was kind of nice to be able to say, oh, I understand what these decks are doing and what these cards are doing. Playing a Goldspan Dragon Blue Red Mirror, it's like, okay, I get it. Or like playing in Sultai, that deck hasn't changed much outside of maybe a handful of cards they play like more Gargaroth and stuff. But you know, you kind of the format's really settled into place, and you get rewarded for understanding what's going on. And all in all, a good standard format.
Yep, I agree. Well, thank you all so much for listening to this week's episode of Constructed Criticism. Hopefully you liked this look back episode, and we'll be back next week talk about the Forgotten Realms cards. Abe, in the time of this recording to the next, we're going to learn 360 cards. So how exciting. If you want to follow Abe, you can find him at More No Things. If you want to find me, you can find me at Mason E. Clark, both of those on Twitter. If you want to watch this YouTube thing and see the nonverbal jokes, see what Abe just did there, and I said all of that, you can go to youtube.com/constructed criticism. The episodes are all up there, and now in video format. So you can see me when I talk with my hands. I move my hands. Now you see that happen, and I'm not self-conscious about it. Why are you thinking that? It's not happening. My palms aren't sweaty. Stop looking at them. Thank you all so much, and we'll see y'all next week for another episode.